The Tales of Robin Hood. We all know them. We've all seen the movies and the cartoons and the books. He's, in a lot of ways, the original superhero, or at least one of the original superheroes. I mean, come on, how many heroes nowadays are even, archers? From Hawkeye to Legolas to everyone's got a Bo from Masters of the Universe. I mean, everyone's got an archer these days, and the motif from that obviously comes from Robin Hood. The first time he was really set down in modern lore was in Ivanhoe by Walter Scott, which, if you haven't read this book, it's actually really awesome. And it's actually where the whole Locksley thing comes from, where he's just known as Lord Locksley for half the book until the big reveal is that he's Robin Hood. I know, spoiler alert on a 100-year-old book. Growing up as a kid, the Disney Robin Hood was beyond one of my favorite movies. It was just, it's fantastic. I mean, not just, in the songs and the animation, having Robin Hood as a fox. I think, the foxes are still vicious animals, I think was really well cast as far as a character. And of course, Prince John and Hiss and the sheriff, Nottingham, the whole cast was amazing. And it just created a lot of cherished childhood memories, to say the least. So when Robin Hood was redone closer to my teen years in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, I was definitely excited for this because it had been years since a Robin Hood movie had been made. These days we're getting one like every summer, and they tend to be like, So Prince of Thieves, not little known fact, but lesser known, the name does actually come from not just an older movie, but Alexandre Dumas, the author, wrote a Robin Hood book. You probably know him best as the author of The Three Musketeers or The Count of Monte Cristo. So obviously he's into the whole swashbuckling genre, and he wrote a really great Robin Hood book that Prince of Thieves was based on. The movie was more based on Raiders of the Lost Ark. At least that was kind of the pitch. It was, how can we do Robin Hood a la Indiana Jones as a sort of action-adventure character? And it added a lot to the modern mythos. Azim as the character from the Crusades, Alan Rickman's amazing performance as the Sheriff of Nottingham. I mean, come on, Hans Gruber is like the greatest bad guy ever. Not to mention the awesome cameo of Sean Connery at the end that wasn't even credited, so you didn't know he was going to show up. And of course, then there's Robin Hood toys. So we've had Robin Hood toys for a few decades, action figures really making their emergence in the 60s and 70s, kind of the Mego form and the 12-inch form with G.I. Joe. But the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves figures was really one of your first true action figure lines based on Robin Hood. It had figures and it also had vehicles and play sets, the whole shebang. And it was a very interesting line, to say the least. Not only because it really brought Robin Hood into true action figure form, but it has some interesting ways it was put together. It had a second wave that never really hit, that was going to include King Richard and some more of the bad guys, new versions of Robin and Azim, as well as some carry-forwards of the sheriff. But unfortunately, we only got one wave. But what a wave it was. I mean, we got at least all the main characters without any of the surprise reveals being given away. We got Alan Rickman as the Sheriff of Nottingham. We got multiple versions of Robin Hood, which actually wound up having multiple head versions. The replaced one, the later one, looking a little bit more like Kevin Costner than the original head. And, et cetera, using soft goods for the cloaks and for the jerkins. And of course, we got Azim, whether or not the colors actually matched the photo, but it still worked really well as a toy. And, again, this was kind of a breakthrough character that has now become almost a steadfast part of the mythology, with even recent movies continuing to adapt this character that was first introduced in Prince of Thieves, or at least, the motif of this character of a friend from the Crusades that comes to England to help Robin. And there were role-play toys, too. You had swords and daggers, and, even though Robin Hood is more of a bow and arrow kind of guy. The really interesting thing, though, about the line is not just that it brought Robin Hood into action figures, but the way it, shall we say, creatively put together parts would be a kind way of putting it. So the Robin Hood line well, actually more giving it some framework in today. In today's action figure world, you can't really use figures from one line to make another. We can't use the Gorilla Grodd from the DC line to make a Masters of the Universe Yellow Gygor. It doesn't work that way because DC owns the Gorilla Grodd sculpt. But back in the day, sharing sculpts was a lot more common. So as an example, the Demolition Man figures that Mattel put out for the Sylvester Stallone, movie. You don't look too closely at that armor or the belt or even the sculpt of the torso there, because you will recognize that that is the body of New Adventures He-Man, just in new colors and with a new head to make it a Demolition Man figure, which is why Demolition Man has an H on his belt for He-Man, or H for Homer. Probably not, probably more for He-Man. Now with the Robin Hood line, there was a rush to market. So when Kenner acquired the license to make these figures, the movie was already underway. Usually, and in today's world, you're doing it well in advance. So they had to kind of look and say, okay, what shortcuts can we take? What other toy lines do we have that we can kind of adapt to get a Robin Hood line out quickly? And obviously, everyone remembers Kenner as the maker of the Star Wars figures, as well as the Superpowers, DC figures. And while they were not perfectly in scale, Star Wars and Superpowers, you could fudge it a little bit. And when you start to examine the Robin Hood figures, and not just the figures, but the playsets and the vehicles, it starts to become obvious where a lot of this came from. Now, some of the shots I'm about to show you are from actionfigureinsider.com. I definitely want to give credit to them. They're an awesome website. You should check them out. So let's start with Robin here. So Robin is a redeco of the Superpowers Green Arrow, hence why he has a G on his belt, just like He-Man with the H on his belt. Basically taking an existing Archer figure that had the strap and making another Archer. Other figures, like Will Scarlet, were combinations of both Robin and Desaad, again from the Superpowers line, mixing and matching parts. Azim used the arms from Green Arrow and the body from Captain Marvel, aka Shazam. May have gotten new legs, or at least retooled legs, without the articulation in it. And again, Little John also getting Hawkman's chest and some parts from Batman. Basically, just doing new heads and using these parts from existing figures allowed Kenner to meet the deadline for getting the figures to market in time for the movie. One of the more curious ones is Friar Tuck, who is obviously the Gamorrean Guard, and it is retooled because you can see the deco, or the detail on the chest is removed, but it's obviously Gamorrean Guard with a new head. Sheriff of Nottingham, also an interesting one, mostly because the head doesn't look a single thing like Alan Rickman. I mean, not even close. At least some of the other figures, like Friar Tuck, clearly got a new head put on the Gamorrean Guard. But looking at the Sheriff of Nottingham figure, this wasn't, they did not sculpt a new Alan Rickman head, and for years, this was actually a big mystery, is where did this head come from? And absolutely give credit where it's due, some fan sites did put it together, and realizing that, this head clearly wasn't designed to be Alan Rickman, it was, put on the figure to look mean, they started putting the pieces together. And again, absolute credit to actionfigureinsider.com for some of these images here. You can see the body from Lex Luthor and the arms again from Green Arrow, but that head, that mysterious head, was finally, some fan sites cracked it and figured out that a RoboCop figure called Chainsaw, one of the Vandals, one of the bad guys from the RoboCop toy line from the early 80s, essentially supplied the head that became the Sheriff of Nottingham. While the body is a little bit smaller, not quite the same scale as Superpowers, more in line with the Star Wars 3 3/4, it was basically a generic, angry-looking head, and using some deco to paint on a mustache and beard and painting the hair black, there you go. There's your side-by-side comparison of how Chainsaw was reused and became the Sheriff of Nottingham's head. All right, so it didn't just end with the figures. The vehicle line also heavily borrowed from previous Kenner lines and kind of kit bashed together in order to give Robin different vehicles and different accessories to play out the battles in Sherwood Forest. There were some original ones, like the Boa bomber and the net launcher, that were created just for the Robin Hood line, and worked very well since there were giant rock slingshots or catapults, I guess, if you will, in the movie. Although they were much more on the villain side than the hero side. But hey, it made total sense, and why not? Plus, it works for a toy, and I think that's the most important thing. Although Robin never really had a. Did he ever use a crossbow? Well, I guess he used the villain's crossbow briefly in the tree scene in the beginning. But again, changing it up, changing the colors, giving accessories that they didn't really use in the movie, much more common in the 80s. So the other original accessory created for the line was the net launcher, which again, not exactly used in the movie, but inspired by the movie. Similar to kind of the Power of the Force mini rigs in Star Wars, which were marketed as just off camera. Like if the camera just tilted a little bit to the left, you might see this. Or, pulled out a little bit more, this was right there, it just didn't make the cut of the movie. At least, that was good enough for the marketing. And for the kiddies, it didn't matter. The point is, you're getting cool things to launch at your Robin Hood figures. All right, so back to the kit bashing. So while we went over the figures and how they used a lot of Superpowers parts and occasionally some Star Wars parts, the vehicles definitely relied on the power of the Ewoks, because much like Sherwood Forest, the Ewoks were warriors in a forest and had a lot of foresty accessories and, places to hang out. So in particular, the battle wagon for Robin Hood was actually 2 Star Wars Ewok accessories, vehicles, combined into one. And, it combined both an on-screen and an inspired-by vehicle that became one Robin Hood vehicle, the battle wagon. So the base of the battle wagon is the Ewok battle wagon with the giant skull on the front removed, because, there's not giant monster skulls in Sherwood Forest. Whereas the Ewok battle wagon, more of a fantasy piece, was able to have a giant skull and was more of a, which acted as the cockpit, and was more of like a charging device. The Robin Hood battle wagon, by removing the skull, it opened up area on the top. And because there was now more area on the top with the skull removed, they could simply place the Ewok assault catapult, which was a different Ewok toy. This one was actually was in the movie and was from the Return of the Jedi line, as opposed to Power of the Force. So essentially, the Ewok battle wagon became the Robin Hood battle wagon by removing the skull. Here you can see the giant skull of the toy. And once that's removed, you have so much more what's called real estate. Even in the toy industry, room on a toy is called real estate. And you could now take this and take the Ewok catapult, which, again, sold separately, and simply place it on top of the battle chariot. And now you had more offensive capabilities and could launch boulders. So there it is. You can see it just sitting there on top of the battle chariot, ready to launch rocks, and now blue rocks instead of gray rocks. But yeah, originally built in the Forest of Endor, now to the Forest of Sherwood. All right, then of course the big one in the line, literally and figuratively, is the playset. So once again, Kenner turned to its beloved Ewok-inspired line, which had the Ewok Village playset, and by adding in some treetop foliage, could easily hide the fact that you may have already bought this toy and it may be sitting in your playroom already, but this time, instead of being populated by Ewoks, it was going to be populated by merry men. All of the features are there: the elevator cage, the rocks, the secret passage, the tree-mounted bases, I guess, or stands. So yeah, simply very little rework was actually needed. The only new tooling was adding some leaves sculpted for the top to give it more of a Sherwood Forest feel. But otherwise, it's all there. The net, the elevator, the rock, You could just populate it now with Sherwood Forest Denzians instead of Ewoks, and it worked as a perfect Sherwood Forest hideout for Robin Hood and his merry men. Very little new tooling needed, and honestly, I don't blame Kenner at all, because how many tree wood sets do you really need to sculpt up if you've got one already in your tooling bank? And again, something like this would never fly today, but back in the 80s, licensing rules were a lot looser, and you could get away with things like this. And honestly, the movie companies were just excited to have toys. It wasn't as much of a competition as it is today to get toys into the aisle. So, while Robin Hood definitely is immortalized in books, and you should definitely, I highly encourage reading the books because they're all great, from, the Howard Pyle to Ivanhoe, et cetera, even some of the original tales. The point is, we're having fun, and that's really all that matters. If toy companies are borrowing from other similar lines and it works, especially in the vintage era, I'm all for it. I get today that there's legal issues with that, but to the end, I'm about fun and I'm about happy endings. And I feel like getting Robin Hood toys was worth the shortcuts they took, because it is a happy ending for Robin Hood fans, and we got some amazing toys out of it. If you like this video and want to see more, let me know what other toy lines to cover, other things to dive into. Love to put some videos together. Subscribing and liking this video is great too, because it tells YouTube to share it with more people, and that's the goal. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.